Hello, hi everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Anna Bradley. I'm Executive Director at Sentient Media, and I am thrilled to welcome you all here today. Just while we wait for folk to join us, I wanted to let you know we're using hashtag Making the Climate Connection on Twitter. So please join in the conversation online, and you can also ask questions in the Zoom chat box here. So just ask away as and when your questions come up. So we are here today to share the findings of a new report produced in collaboration with Faunalytics entitled Animal Agriculture is the Missing Piece in the climate change coverage. So as some of you might already know, our mission at Sentient Media is to really change and shift the conversation around animal agriculture in the media. But today what we realize is that we actually have to start this conversation in climate media to balance the scales. And we need to do that with some urgency. There is a huge dearth of media coverage around one of the key contributing factors towards climate crisis. That's animal agriculture accounts for at least 14.5% of greenhouse gas emissions. And it was only referenced 7% of the time in the climate reporting that we analysed. Why? So today with our guests, we're going to explore just how ignored this topic is, what the roadblocks are, what the solutions are to getting better coverage. And our hope is that with today's event, we'll inspire some of you, we'll encourage some of you to report, who do already report on climate issues, to consider the animal agriculture angle. Every time we acknowledge this, every time we add a line about the animal agriculture industry, we get closer to sharing a more accurate piece of information with the public, so we can allow people to decide how they want to respond with all the facts. So today we have panel one, which is roadblocks to better coverage, followed by a Q&A, where obviously I'm going to be hosting your Q&A, so please keep your questions coming in throughout. And then we go on to panel two, solutions to better coverage, followed by another Q&A. You are then invited to stick around for 20 minutes with the team at Faunalytics, with the researchers, and with myself and Jenny Splitter and some of the panelists as well, to have an extended Q&A and dig into how we built this research. So thank you to each of our panelists for being here. I'm really excited by the lineup we have today. There's a great mix of people, all of whom are showing that they're brave enough to talk about these issues and step into the arena. So thank you to each of you who are attending. We sold out of this event so quickly. It was incredible. We had to open up even more spots. So before we get into the panels, I am going to hand over to one of the lead authors on the report, Connie Arevalo. So she's going to share with us a little bit about how she got into this and the report. I'm going to share my screen, Connie, but over to you.
Wonderful. So for this project, we were interested in seeing how often animal agriculture is being discussed by the media in relation to climate change. And when it is discussed, what does that narrative look like? So to do this, we looked at 1,000 articles about climate change from 10 major US news outlets. And we determined the percentage of those articles that mentioned animal agriculture versus other causes of climate change, which you can see listed in this figure. And we analyzed all animal agriculture articles, and we read through a random sample of articles that did not discuss animal agriculture to see what was being done well in terms of that coverage, what could be improved, and if there were any missed opportunities to bring up animal agriculture. And what we found was that just 7% of the articles that we looked at brought up animal agriculture in some way. Now that is just 69 out of 1,000 articles. And not only is that really low coverage, but as you can see from this figure, it's particularly low compared to other causes of climate change, particularly compared to mining, manufacturing and energy production, emissions, fossil fuels, and transportation, which as you can see, were brought up in as many as 68% of the articles that we read through, that we looked at, sorry. Now, overall, animal agriculture was not really being discussed in much depth, meaning there was generally a lack of context regarding the emissions and the environmental degradation that are caused by the industry. In fact, we often found that animal ag was presented as more of a victim of climate change rather than as a cause of it. And when diets were discussed, it was often just a quick mention of meat reduction in a list of actions that people can take to fight the climate crisis, again, without really giving much context about the connection between our diets and climate change. Now, we did find that a few articles did a really good job at talking about this connection, but these were unfortunately a rare find. Now, I am happy to answer any questions you have about the study during the Q&A session at the end. But for now, I'll pass it over to Jenny to get the panel started.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Connie. And thank you so much to you and the rest of your team for all the hard work you put into this. And yes, time to welcome our panelists. And I'm thrilled to hand over to our managing editor, Jenny Splitter, who is going to host the first panel for us now. Over to you, Jenny.
Anna. Hi, everyone. I'm so glad we're having this conversation today. We're going to kick off our first panel talking about kind of the roadblocks to coverage. Before we get into that, I wanted to ask Dan Blaustein-Reto from the Breakthrough Institute, Director of Food and Ag for the Breakthrough Institute. Can you tell us, you had an interesting blog post about kind of the percent of emissions from livestock that came out recently, and then Vox also did a follow-up story on that. So I was wondering if you could kind of kick us off by talking about just like, do we know how much of the share of climate change emissions comes from meat and dairy?
Thanks, Jenny, and thanks everyone for organizing this and attending, first of all. And in short, yes. So there's extensive research on the role of the food system in climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. The food system overall, from really farm to fork, accounts for something on the order of 25 to 30% of greenhouse gas emissions, and maybe up to about 1/3 when you include non-food agricultural products like cotton and biofuels. But I think, as many of us know and why we're here today, livestock are, as people say, the elephant in the room, the largest contributor to food system emissions. Cows and other ruminants are effectively methane factories, producing methane through biological processes. And it's not just the animals themselves, it's also their land use, as growing demand for food increases the amount of land that's necessary for animal agriculture. Forests continue to be taken down to expand production. And then also there's a fair amount of emissions that come from growing feed crops themselves, like corn, soy, alfalfa, etc. And when you take this all into account, there's a pretty wide range of different estimates for emissions. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, or FAO for short, estimated last fall that livestock accounted for about 11% of global greenhouse gas emissions as of 2015, the most recent year for which they have all of the data. But other estimates in the peer review literature peg the number closer perhaps to 20%. So our piece at Breakthrough and the great new piece at Vox discuss this range and lots of the uncertainties inherent in estimating methane emissions, emissions from land use change, etc. I think taking all of this into account, it's fair to say that livestock generates something on the order of 10 to 20% of emissions, although I want to also emphasize that this is a changing number. It will change as livestock production shifts, as emissions from other sectors shift, and as people develop different and improved methods.
Great, thank you. And for anyone, maybe we can put in the Q&A the link to the Vox article if folks haven't read it, because I think it was a really good explanation of kind of the different studies, but also for carbon opportunity costs, which is a topic I personally find challenging to cover and explain in easy terms that everyone can understand. And that piece was by Sophie Coveney, by the way, who also writes for us sometimes. Okay, so I wanted to turn to the journalists on this panel, and I think maybe just to start to hear from everyone, like, why do you think that the topic of emissions from animal ag is covered kind of comparatively smaller than other sources of emissions in climate media? Tamar, I'm going to start with Tamar Haspel. I keep forgetting to say everyone's title because I sort of feel like I know all of you, but author and columnist at the Washington Post. So love to
Thanks,
hear.
Jenny, and thanks for inviting me and thanks for hosting this. I think there are a number of reasons, but I actually think the predominant one is that people like meat. And so writing about it becomes kind of a challenging thing because you basically end up telling people to eat less beef. And that's a message that people tend to be hostile to. Ask me how I know. And it's not like writing about other kinds of like fossil fuels, because when we're talking about fossil fuels, we're talking about giving people an alternative. But when we're talking about meat, the alternatives that we give them are unpalatable to a lot of people, figuratively, literally, every which way that it can be unpalatable. And so the fact that people like it, there's no good alternative. You end up sounding like a nanny stater when you talk about it. And also, it's disputed. I mean, nobody really disagrees fundamentally about fossil fuels, but people do disagree fundamentally about meat. Now, I think that there's a right and a wrong here, and some of the people who disagree are simply wrong. But there is a strong contingent disagreeing, which means that if you're going to write about it, kind of every time you do it, you sort of have to adjudicate it over and over again. So I think that animal ag and meat are sort of materially different from some of the other things that climate journalists write about. And it's kind of easy to gloss over it.
Yeah, it just as you're talking makes me think that like writing about energy, no one really starts questioning what you're doing in your own home usually. Whereas if you're someone who writes about the food system, usually it does tend to get personal because we all know food is personal. Michael Grunwald, who's author and columnist at Canary Media, I'm going to remember to get everyone's title in here. Do you have any thoughts on like why this topic isn't necessarily covered as much by climate media?
Well, I do agree that there's sort of a demand side problem rather than necessarily a supply side problem, right? I mean, usually panels like this, we all talk about how the media suck and you know, they're doing it all wrong. And of course the media does suck and we are doing it all wrong. But in this case, I agree with Tamara that there's sort of a problem on the audience demand side, but I'm not sure I agree that it's just because people like meat. I actually think that, you know, sort of stories about how kind of meat is the problem are actually a little bit cliquey. And people do sort of like those stories, even if they don't like the answer. But I think talking about animal agriculture, I mean, I think it's awesome that you got 700 people to listen to this. But I've found it very difficult, you know, now that I'm sort of, you know, I've gone from Politico magazine writing about, you know, Trump and, you know, the sexy stuff to trying to write about, you know, how to feed the world without frying the world. I think most of what we're talking about is farms and forests that make up 98.5% of our planet, or at least our land. But it's flyover country, right? It's like we fly over it or we hike through it or we, you know, but we get the fruits of it, but we don't really think about it in our day-to-day life. And I'm not sure people are all that interested in it. There's this real demand for, you know, I find like people are kind of looking for ammunition rather than information. And so to some extent, like if there are people who have a kind of a dog in this fight, and so if you write about regenerative agriculture or industrial agriculture, people who love or hate those things will pay attention. But for most of us who are just trying to hash out these issues of food and farms and forests and, you know, how to make the emissions work and the land use work and what are technologies that can improve it, I don't think people give a shit. I wish they did.
Great.
I'm writing a book about it, but you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, anyway, I have thoughts, but I'm not a panelist, I'm just a moderator today. So Sonali Figueres, who is founder of Green Queen, right? You're nodding along. Did you have some thoughts on that and like why this is not always such a well-covered topic. You and I have been in sort of climate journalist calls where we're both like systems, and sometimes we're the only people yelling. So, oh, and you're muted. Unmute. Still muted.
I'm nodding along. Definitely some really good points by both Tamara and Michael. I think there's no doubt that food is very different than energy and transport and weather and a lot of these other associated topics that kind of make up climate headlines. But I think that we're being a little unfair about kind of food in the climate pantheon, if you will, because if you look at the work of the great folks at Covering Climate Now, just 4 years ago, they came into existence because the climate story wasn't being told properly enough in mainstream media. And now we're sort of like taking it for granted that like people are considering things like energy and transport in the climate story and even things like weather. But that wasn't the case 4 years ago. And I don't feel like food has had its Covering Climate Now moment. And as you know, Jenny, I actually wrote a proposal that I sent to you and that I sent to Covering Climate Now, which is basically like, can we please launch Covering Food and Climate Now? Because I just don't know that context is there for most people, that we're not solving the climate crisis without sorting out how we grow our food. And I also find that a lot of the answers that I'm hearing tend to be from regions where, like North America and potentially Europe, where there's plenty of farmland and there's plenty of ruminating animals. I'm sitting in Asia. We have hundreds of millions of people in urban cities. And I think when you're in Asia, which is where 60% of the world's population lives, and where a lot of kind of social mobility and economic mobility is happening, and we know that we have kind of this like supply and demand problem with like so many people and not enough kind of land to grow food, I think there's a little bit more of an awareness that we sort of have to figure stuff out and think alternatively. And so even all our governments have to think about food security differently. But again, we don't see that really reflected in the media. So I think there's the livestock issue. There's also just like the basic food systems issue. And I don't know that it's clear to most people that there is this food and climate connection. Now, I think Tamara's right, though. Food is very different from energy and transport. It's very personal. I mean, for most of our history as a species, just getting food was kind of the whole point of what we were trying to do to survive. So food plays a very different role for people than, what energy source is coming into their home. So I think even if we did get to 4 years from now where food is being reported on in a much stronger way in the climate story, I still think it will be challenging. And I still think there will be people that come to the table looking for ammunition, not information. That was a great line, Michael. But I don't think we've given food a fair shot yet in the climate story.
I just want to make sure we
not livestock at all.
Yeah. I want to make sure we get Nico in here. So because actually Nico Mutsi, I'm going to say your last name wrong, from Madre Brava, the managing director of Madre Brava, and who also did some research that looked at this, but also more sweeping research. So because Sonali mentioned like what people know, so you have some insight on that based on the reporting or the study you all did. Can you share a little bit about that?
So, thanks for the invitation and hi to everyone. On your first question, I agree with the fact that food is very cultural and it's personal, not fossil fuels. The heating up in your home, the fuel that you put in your car is not so relatable. I think that is based on the analysis we did, the media analysis we did, which wasn't as exhaustive as the one that you did, guys. But it came to the same conclusions. And what we tend to see is that most of the coverage on the climate impacts of meat is driven by NGOs and scientific studies. And our work on this for the past year has seen that, and rightly so, we haven't seen a lot of campaigning groups and philanthropy money going into this space. and that creates a sort of underreporting or vacuum of news stories. I think that's something that we're going to see change now as we realize that food is the next frontier in the climate battle. But we are basically paying that cost of fewer campaigning groups and fewer fewer philanthropy dollars coming into this space, as we have now starting to decarbonize thanks to the solar revolution and the wind revolution, energy, and then transport with electrification of transport. I'm hopeful that we could see that. And the other point I wanted to make is the size of the industry that we are talking about. If we should not underestimate the misinformation campaigns and the spin doctors by the industry, and we have seen more and more of that work happening. But it's just to give you a size of the problem. The smartphone industry is around roughly globally $500 billion business. The meat industry is almost 3 times that. It's 1.3, 1.4 trillion. So that also shows the resources they have available to basically protect their business model, which is obviously rotten and obsolete. When it comes to the research we did on consumers in the UK, France, Germany, the US, and Brazil, we see that across the globe, in this, when you ask people to rank the top 5, or from a list of topics and contributors to climate change, what are the leading drivers? Industrial meat comes at the bottom, and things like even aviation or cars, which are smaller in size, do come top of mind, and that's because of reporting or the lack of reporting in the media.
Thank you. And thanks for that. I do want to ask Tamar, just because, and everyone at this point, just like jump in, not all at once, but let's definitely just dig. I know you all have lots of things to say, but because I've known, your coverage on GMOs, I was curious if there were any kind of through lines or things that you see that were sort of challenging in covering that issue that come up again in covering this issue, that, I don't know, maybe there are some lessons there for journalists.
There totally are. And one of the through lines, and a couple people have mentioned, what are the things that people are interested in? And there are a couple of flashpoints in food that do get people interested. And GMOs were certainly one of them. I don't know that they really are anymore, thankfully. But I was writing my column when it was all the rage. And I think this idea of replacing natural foods with artificial things is something that people really balk at. It's something that people can get united against. But if you widen the lens and you say, okay, well, what are the other things? And suddenly your comment about having more, better, deeper food coverage, on the one hand, I am so there for that. And my column's subhead should be, boring people witless with agronomical minutia, since whenever my column has been in. And if we're writing about climate and agriculture, the Venn diagram of stories that are relevant and stories that people are interested in, I think the overlap is pretty small. And if you're talking about agriculture in a bigger way, nobody's going to want to know about the new study that shows, yield suppression from cover crops or no-till sequestering carbon. I'm an expert on what bores people witless, and those things bore people witless. And so, but if you're talking about animal ag specifically, it becomes really problematic because, your bottom line is always, eat less beef. And, you guys are Sentient Media. You care about animal ag in so many ways. And one of the difficulties is that if we're going to have a food supply that is both it has an animal food supply that is both has a smaller impact and better animal welfare, those two goals are at odds, because as soon as you make the system less efficient, which is what animal welfare requires, you make it more impactful. And so, once you say, hey, eat less beef, there's not much left for people who are thinking about this from a perspective of what can I do with my diet, and what you're left with is the 7 people who are actually interested in agriculture.
Yeah, I mean, and not everyone shares my opinion at Sentient Media, but my feeling is like, a good piece of coverage will at least address the trade-offs there. Since I don't think, like that I don't think most people think the food system is going to go sort of like vegan overnight or something like that. But I think like at least what I hope for is, and what we try to do is to just like address the trade-offs of that tension that you're talking about. That, if everybody just eats more chicken, what does that look like for our food system, and for the animals in our food system, right? I'm curious, I did want to ask Mike about this piece you wrote about kind of ranching that was almost like at the kind of, I guess not epicenter, but at a spot where deforestation, where there's like a higher risk of deforestation. Because I really enjoyed that piece, and maybe I'm probably one of those few people, maybe, that enjoys being bored witless by tomorrow or something like that. But yeah, so like, what was the feedback, or maybe can you just tell us a little bit about that piece? Because what I appreciated in that coverage was that you did talk about the things that like, this might not work actually. Like this isn't a solution that is just going to be, we'll just implement it and everything will be better, but like it might actually not work, which I think is kind of rare in coverage in this space, I'd say.
Well, I appreciate your feedback, Jenny. I think it's the first I've gotten.
No. I know that's not true because I saw people talking about it on Twitter. So
yeah.
we all is reflective.
I may have been spoiled from when I wrote it, from when I used to write about, sexy things. But I will say, look, I mean,
I've always been boring, so it's easy for me.
Well, remember, I used to write about like, the boring part of sexy things. I'd write about transportation and housing policy and climate policy. And I have to say that I have found it even harder to get people to listen to this stuff, even when I'm, trying to set scenes in Brazil and, using Jimmy Fallon in my lead or the West Wing. I do find it's very tough to, to get people to focus on the connection between, what's happening out in some pasture in the middle of nowhere and what's, happening to their lives and the planet they call home. It's, I do really think it's challenging. I mean, that piece, and I really do appreciate your kind words about it, but in some ways that touched on every kind of as hot button as you can get in this space, right? I mean, it kind of looked into the, sort of regenerative versus industrial and sort of showed that there were kind of aspects to each of it. It talked about the question of personal diets and the problem of beef, which is something that people care about. And, when people, put AOC on the cover of their magazines with farting cows, it's because this is sort of, at least has some kind of political salience. I even mentioned in that piece that I've cut off, I've stopped eating beef, but I fell off the wagon in Brazil, which is actually the only thing I got feedback from that piece. But I just think it's very difficult, like as Sonali mentioned, like we are, even if it's a few years, I would say like the kind of food conversation is probably about 20 years behind the energy conversation. And it is catching up, but it's not visceral to people in the way that that energy is, that they immediately know energy is a climate issue. Food is a cow's issue, or a diet issue. And there are people who care about that, but I don't think it is yet a general interest topic. But hopefully by the time my book is published, it will be.
is it that suddenly you might have thoughts on this? Like, is it that, it's not like, I know that, when GMOs were all the rage, but also pesticides and things like that. A lot of what drove the traffic is like that, this might be unhealthy for me personally, rather than thinking about kind of health of the planet, animal welfare, et cetera. So, and you have a very specific or more specific readership, something like you're in Hong Kong. So I'm wondering, like, do you think that's part of the tension of like people maybe being more interested in their own immediate, kind of what they perceive as their immediate health versus sort of planetary health, which maybe seems a little more removed from them?
I mean, I think consumers and people in general always, I'm a bit of a cynic. I think that we always care about our own health and our own family's health more than the planet's health. So I do think that when you do a story that is focused on human health, it has a much bigger impact. I think a lot of the conversation I'm hearing, though, has a lot of kind of very North American conclusions to it. Because, for example, in Asia, one thing that's very different than in Europe and the US is that for most Asians, eating a lot of meat is already considered not super healthy. It's desirable from a status point of view, and it is definitely associated with wealth and high status, but it's also associated with high cholesterol and heart disease. So you don't have to make that argument as well. I also think a lot of what we're talking about is we're very much generalizing the audience, whereas I think you can see very well that like younger audiences have a very different view on this than older audiences. And so depending on what media and what format of the media you're talking to, you're getting a very different response. And I also think that we need to look at what's going on in Europe, because I do think that in Europe there is some success that is coming through with flexitarianism. So, I mean, even in a country like France, I mean, in a country like Germany, we're at, like, depending on the figures you look at, 55% flexitarianism. And it's a mix of multiple things. It's a mix of, one, the EU as a bloc is much stronger on climate policy. Two, a lot of the actual individual governments in some of those countries, like the German health minister and the German, he's making comments about reducing meat. He's putting that in his, countrywide nutrition plan. That's not happening in the US in the same way. And then there's also the what I've read a lot about is that in Europe, the younger generation seems to have much more of an impact on the older generation in terms of helping change household habits. So while I agree that, Tamara is saying, people don't want to eat meat alternatives because they're processed or because they're not natural, but we are seeing that in some of those countries, people are putting them in their shopping baskets once or twice a week. And I think media there is a lot more balanced around climate. And I think that the average European has no interest in going vegan, but also is completely convinced that there is a climate crisis. And what I think has happened in what I see in the North American discourse is that a lot of the kind of meat, livestock, agriculture conversation is very linked to the vegan conversation, which is an animal welfare conversation, which is also kind of a movement and an activist conversation, which I think, unfortunately, puts a lot of people off.
Jenny, can I jump in for 1 second here? Because
yes,
I think those are
Anna's going to hop in with questions after that, just from the audience.
Okay,
so
those are really good points. And I've been watching what's going on in France and Germany and marveling that people seem to be actually reducing meat consumption. And it's not just self-reported, it's meat sales are decreasing in some of those countries. And so I think one of the whole, across the board, it's going down. And we see like basically none of that in the United States. And so part of the conversation, I think, should be why is the United States different? And I write primarily for an American audience. And so maybe we can't talk about this without talking about how politicized meat has become. And if we have some left leaners who are cutting back, they're more than made up for it by some people on the other side who are doubling down on meat. And Sonali, those are great points.
Yeah, those are all really great points. Thanks everybody for this amazing conversation. And I just want to encourage the audience. We have opened up the Q&A so you can upvote the questions that are being placed in there. The first one I'm going to start with here is partly to your point, Tamar, that you just made, but open to anybody on the panel. Something that's lacking in reporting is how recent the vast meat consumption that is the norm. So people think that this has been how people have always eaten, and it really isn't. Do the panel think that it would be useful to address this or not?
I'll take that. I think it's true. Historically, it's not the norm, but in recent memory in the United States, at least, it is the norm. And so because people, as we've already established, are relentlessly focused on their own experience, you know, I'm not sure that pointing out that, you know, 50 years ago we ate less meat and 100 years ago we ate a lot less meat is terribly useful. That, you know, meat consumption as we know it is sort of the hand we've been dealt, and it's very hard to dislodge the sense that this is just what normal eating is. People in the nutrition community have been trying to dislodge ideas about normal eating for decades and made no headway at all. So I think that's an uphill battle.
I would say, to add to what Tamara was saying, that is true. I mean, diet shifts are happening, but not at the pace needed to get to 1.5. And I don't know who was referring to this, but the alternatives are getting better, but are not there yet. And before we get an alternative that is as tasty and price-wise is also cheap and is convenient, it's going to be really hard to shift the numbers that we need to shift. And it's completely true, Sonali, that the younger generations in Europe are shifting, and there is a meat reduction. And the research that we have done, the consumer polls, shows that 58% of Germans aspire or self-reported, want to cut down on meat and try alternatives in the next 2 years. 58%. That is, you know, a very significant portion of the population. But if the products, the alternatives are not there, we're gonna keep finding roadblocks to that.
I think that.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think that's a big story also, the changes in trends on an annual basis or any other basis, in the same way that changes in fossil fuel use or renewable energy build outs, greenhouse gas emissions are big stories. I think so too. It is you know, changes in the rates of consumption of alternative proteins or different types of meats. Something I'm very much keeping an eye on is where consumption goes in the Netherlands, for instance, where alternative proteins seem to be near or at price parity with conventional meats. Will we see changes in kind of substantial decreases in meat consumption there, as some people expect? What does that kind of foretell for other countries?
Yeah, I mean, in Germany, all supermarkets have very affordable meat alternatives, 60 different kinds. It's the same in France, the same in the Netherlands. I think the alternative protein discussion is one that takes over and could be an entirely different discussion. But I would say, as someone who's part of the industry and has been there since the beginning, there have been a lot of mistakes made in how it has been framed and how we have allowed it to be portrayed in the media. The idea that like every alternative is processed is ridiculous. There are over 1,000 companies. There are plenty that are clean label and not processed. I think Beyond and Impossible get way too much airtime as avatars of an entire industry that is actually quite broad. I think that we also must recognize, this goes back to Tamar's question, like, should we talk about the fact that you know, meat wasn't consumed in the same amounts 50 years ago? Yes and no, because at the end of the day, we must recognize that meat is a high status food in multiple ways. It's a high calorie food. It's a food that historically was difficult to get. It's a food that historically was associated with wealth and the most powerful people in society. I don't know that we get rid of that overnight. And someone has a comment in the questions that I think is interesting about how they're a doctor in the UK trying to promote plant-powered diets, and that they they feel that we should separate veganism as an ethical life choice from plant-based diets for planetary personal health. And I think that's the success story that I really see in Europe, where I was at a climate conference and no one was a vegan, but everyone was reducing meat consumption. And that's really what's going to move the needle from an emissions point of view. That is not the conversation you see in the media, where it feels like every attempt to talk about reducing meat is weaponized as trying to take away someone's identity, or family tradition or what have you, culture. And that's where things get really polarized and dangerous, and where people kind of shut off and people start being ammunition over information. I'm going to keep repeating that, Michael.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think as we're still kind of thinking about the roadblocks, you were just kind of segueing into the solutions there. But just before we move away from the roadblocks, a couple of the top questions here are asking what we think about the role the big agriculture lobby plays in the food climate change discussion. Do we feel that this the IPCC synergy report was toned down on dietary change due to the pressure from these kinds of vested interests? Is that one of the big roadblocks that we're facing as well?
I don't know how you cannot answer 100% yes. I mean, the industry has so much money. I mean, just beef subsidies, even big seafood subsidies. We're just up against, I mean, the beef check program where every per cattle you get $1 to start marketing meat. Like there's no, as someone was writing in an article I was editing, there's no alt protein checkoff program. We're just up against, there's now like an MBA that you can get to like teach people how to eat more meat. I mean, we are up against so much lobbying. And we are up against so many dollars for that lobbying. And frankly, politically, there just isn't enough support either, that aligns with the data you're talking about around percentage of emissions of our global greenhouse gas budget. Like it doesn't add up, like how much money is spent to find solutions per percentage that's in relation to the percentage of greenhouse gas emissions.
I know exactly what Tamar's going to say right now. Go ahead.
Oh, no, you don't. I'm pretty sure you don't. I'll buy you a beer if you know what I'm going to say.
All right.
What I'm going to say is that I think one of the things that I think is missing from the climate coverage of beef is any kind of empathy for ranchers who have been trying to be good stewards of their land, often for generations, and have done things in some cases that have brought back biodiversity to their lands, that have in some cases sequestered carbon, and they're undone by basically methane, which is this thing that you can't see. And so to have these people who have been conscientious, who have had this idea that has come down through their families that they are feeding people quality food, all of a sudden this climate thing happens and they're dietary enemy number one. I think that's a really tough spot to be in. And I feel for some of these people who are raising cattle in the best way they know how and are watching their livelihood slip away.
I did not think you were going to say that. That's true. I think it's the way we cover farmers is very, I don't see it quite like that, because I do think there's a lot of positive coverage, but I also think I think we could do a lot better in how we cover farmers, I would say, because I think that sometimes journalists in general, I think tend to see it as sort of this like binary, almost like we have to paint the farmer as the beginning of the story and the hero, or it's the enemy, like rather than it being a more complex situation. We could say a lot more about that, but
we shall get into that. And yeah, thank you so much to our first panel there, talking about the roadblocks that we've been facing. I hope you're all going to stick around for the Q&A. We'll do an extended Q&A with the audience afterwards. And then right now we're going to get on to panel number 2, where we're going to be talking about the solutions. So Jenny, over to you, and I'll promote all of our panelists now.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we're going to talk in this panel about kind of by solutions, we don't just mean like solutions journalism, but actually ways to sort of get more coverage on this topic and get better coverage. And I'm talking in this panel to, there we go. And we still need Matt, there's Matt. On the journalist side, a lot of journalists who have actually been actually all our journalists have obviously been covering this topic, but there's some great stories on this panel. But I want to start with Matt Hayek, who is a researcher and assistant professor of environmental studies at NYU. And I wonder if you could kick us off with just kind of, what are 2 or 3 things that you feel like journalists in the space should know or should be looking at?
I think there have been so many smart things that have been said already. I mean, in general, across the board, we just need more climate literacy for all journalists. Whether you're on a science and climate desk, or whether you're on a business desk, or whatever else. I mean, climate is so quickly beginning to touch all parts of our lives. So in general, I think we need a lot more of the news, traditional and new media to be having a fraction of their beat or background research be climate. But what does that look like, as opposed to just me lecturing a bunch of journalists to go educate themselves? I think concretely there are a few things. One of which would be to understand that the climate problem is coming from under the ground, that is fossil fuels, and also the surface of the earth, that is all the land use change and farming that we're doing on it. Because the largest non-fossil source of CO2 is the deforestation and other land use change that we're clearing more lands predominantly to make room for more agriculture, and the predominant fraction of that is more animal agriculture. For non-CO2 greenhouse gases, that these exist in the first place. And Matt Reynolds and Tamara and others have, kind of been beating this methane and even nitrous oxide drums. Those are the 2 and second and third most prominent greenhouse gases if we adjust by both their total concentrations and emissions into the atmosphere, as well as the fact that each molecule warms even more than CO2. So methane and nitrous oxide, the largest sources on Earth of both of those are also agriculture. And of those fractions, the predominant fraction is animal agriculture. So just having those be understood and known as like the first piece of background research, I think would make all of the ways that we want to scaffold off of this more ubiquitously known, more widely covered than that 70%, that 7% fraction. And lastly, that and this was mentioned as well, production and consumption needs to change somehow. And I think there are ways that I heard being discussed in the last panel that, how we change consumption, I think was a little overdetermined. Well, it has to be beef reduction. Well, it has to be alternative proteins, where it has, and I don't think anyone was saying that outright, but I do just want to remind ourselves that there's a lot of different ways that consumption could change and still be more climate compatible. Now, how do we thread the needle of both climate as well as water use and biodiversity and zoonotic disease, which I've moved into recently? I think that's a much wider question, and animal welfare. That's a much wider question where there are these serious trade-offs, but it has to be production and consumption changing. Lastly, I think it would help a lot of media to understand that the people whose profits and research are funded by animal agriculture industry and trade groups are obviously going to say not to reduce or change consumption, that this should be treated as a given, and every mention of anyone from that background or that funding stream saying we don't need to change consumption should be qualified with a line of where they're getting their money and what their otherwise conflicts of interests are. I think that would make a lot of the climate reporting that does mention animal agriculture a lot more clear and straightforward. So a lot of articles that do discuss the animal agriculture link frame reducing or changing consumption as unrealistic, radical, that is, not everyone's going to become a vegan overnight, or too slow. Well, this isn't going to happen today, so instead we're, feeding cows seaweed or pulling on this efficiency lever, or whatever else. We're not talking about that today because that's pie in the sky. You know, those are very effective ways to frame that conversation. So I think in a lot of ways, both intentionally and unintentionally, the very rich conversation that we could be having around animal agriculture has been a little too over determined, and that Overton window of what's feasible to debate has shrunk in an uncomfortable way for me. And I'm just saying, as a scientist who has the luxury of, you know, all of the time in the world to think about these problems.
Well, thanks for those comments. And since you kind of mentioned the industry angle, I might start with Georgina. Georgina Justin, reporter for Inside Climate News. Just because you've done so much coverage, really, like, I think kind of uncovering some of the industry connections and that kind of focus. So can you talk a little bit about that and just like what kinds of stories have really like broken through for your, you know, to your audience in sort of the ag space, the ag climate space?
Sure. And so I apologize. Some loud lawn cutting machinery just fired up outside my house. So I'm sorry about that. So I mean, I think, you know, this kind of harkens back a little bit to the previous panel, but part of why there has not been as much coverage of this intersection of animal ag and climate change in the past is because the industry has very successfully, for a very long time, made it almost impossible to know the greenhouse gas implications or the polluting implications of these industries. So you look at the bedrock environmental laws of the 1970s, Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act, no mention of agriculture, of course. And subsequently, in every possible iteration or updating of these laws, there's always been a carve out for agriculture. There's a, you know, rider in every annual appropriations bill that says we should not be, you know, that we can't be measuring methane. Thune just introduced a bill last fall that would once again sort of solidify that in separate legislation. So basically, the greenhouse gas reporting program doesn't require agriculture to report methane. So the industry influence over the course of the last 50 years has made it really hard to get information. And I think that's one of the reasons, you know, people don't want to kind of stick their toe in these waters, because it's, you know, things get messy quickly or it's difficult. And yeah, I think that, and they've been able to, the industry, largely the Farm Bureau, has really been able to use the American farmer as kind of a straw man and say it. And so every time you write negatively about the industry, they frame it as like an ad hominem attack on the American farmer, when in fact, this is not about the American farmer. It's about the massive consolidation in the industry, crazy corporate profits, et cetera. So they can also kind of complicate matters by, you know, sort of confusing people about the diet component of meat too, and say, well, no, you need a little meat. And in some cases, you know, people will say, well, this is, you're being unfair to pastoralists in Africa if you say that you know, we shouldn't eat meat. Well, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, you know, CAFOs in southern Idaho where there's no water.
Yeah, thank you. That's super well said. Matt Reynolds, senior science reporter at Wired. Wanted to turn to you because just maybe, obviously Wired sort of covers these stories very differently than Inside Climate, but I'm curious, like, if you could share some of the coverage that on this topic that have like kind of broken through to your readers. I feel like a lot of the maybe alternatives have been maybe at least I've enjoyed that coverage. Wondering that, you know, as we've learned, I'm apparently a strange reader interested in tomorrow's boring facts. But anyway, so yeah, like, which of the stories have kind of broken through for your audience in this area?
Yeah, I think we need to remember, if we're thinking about, well, how do we attract journalists to writing about climate animal connection, is there's actually so many fascinating, exciting stories to tell in this, because I think sometimes we can fall back on this idea that, like, well, we need to rattle off the 14.5% figure, we need to, say this, we need to get this, and it feels like either what you're doing is just explaining stuff that exists in the past, or what you're doing is just like regurgitating some facts that we're all familiar with that are really important, but like for journalists maybe aren't super exciting to go back to. But I would love to see more journalism that gets all in, into these interesting, questions. Like, so one piece that Matthew helped out with was looking at like low carbon beef claims and saying, well, what does it mean to, make this, make this claim and want to make this labeling claim, and can you even have this kind of category of low carbon beef? And that's because that was something that's being implemented, last January, and we're seeing it happen again with Tyson and its braised beef, and I was really pleased to see that Emily Aitken in the Heated newsletter was doing some reporting around that, because it's happening now. It's super exciting and it's impactful, right? These are decisions happening now, and I think even looking into other questions like, okay, we know that McDonald's didn't pick up Beyond Meat in the US. Well, how come it didn't? And why did it keep it in the UK? And why is it different in Europe? And all these questions, I think, are open questions and super interesting. And I think that, and this kind of speaks a little bit to the conversation of the last panel, is that everyone knows this, right? In this space, it can feel really divisive. Like either you're on the side of alt proteins, or you're against it, or you believe in this and you don't. And I think that we need to be open to the idea that reporting is kind of messy, and sometimes things come out that people don't want to hear about. But maybe actually this is all about working towards a kind of better goal and kind of doing this stuff out in the open, that actually that's where the value comes from. And I think that if we frame reporting, that it's not about just getting across these kind of key facts, and if you mention emissions, you also mention eutrophication, or you mention all these things, but saying, hey, there are actually so many great stories to tell, and they're not just the normal stories about, seaweed will solve us, or technology, or we just improve this and it fixes everything. There's so many interesting, exciting, complicated narratives to tell that I would just love to kind of be like, it's juicy, it's exciting, it's controversial, it's, and there's interesting characters. I would love people to be excited about it in the same way that they're excited about, I don't know, greenwashing in the fossil fuel industries, all this stuff that we're more familiar with.
I think, it's a good reminder that like I always have this tension in my own reporting of like I'm obsessed with data, and data makes me feel safe and comfortable, and also is not always like the best storytelling. So like I have to pull myself out of the sort of like data hole and think about characters, because those are the things, like, people like stories, obviously. And like you're getting me all like hyped up with your excitement, so I appreciate that, because there are so many stories to tell, and solutions, and a solution story can be an unsuccessful solution, and like what is not working, as the Solutions Journalism Network will tell you. So I want to talk to both Hannah and Claire. I'm torn, but since we're talking kind of like big picture a little bit, Anna, maybe you could just jump in and mention kind of some of the things maybe you all are learning at Covering Climate now about kind of like how to boost coverage in areas that maybe need it, how to boost and improve coverage in areas of climate, the climate story, that like what is working.
I think it's hello everyone. It's good to be here with you. It's a really great group and I'm learning so much. So thank you for that. At Covering Climate Now, through a lot of conversations, we're learning I think the basic fact that undergirds the mission of Covering Climate Now is that journalists need to be helped compassionately in understanding that climate is an everything story. Almost every story that they report, think about, conceive of, will have a climate connection. And that we are at such an initial stage in journalism of making that connection that, sometimes I think, from the perspective of somebody who's looking at the press and thinking about what we could be doing as a body better, it can be a little frustrating to say, why aren't we seeing these stories more? Why aren't we seeing this connection made more? When the answer is, well, it's because journalists on a whole, not the people on this panel, but on a whole, are not grounded in some basic facts. And so one of the core mission for us at this moment in time, I think we were sort of hopeful that it would be a little further along, but is, hey, climate change is here. 1.5 is a threat, and we have to keep as many fossil fuels in the ground as possible. We have to stop emitting carbon, methane, all of these greenhouse gases as soon as possible. And it's going to be hard. And getting journalists comfortable with the it's going to be hard message, that it's not going to be solvable in one story, that this is going to be for the rest of their lives, is also a really tough place to be. So I think consistently think about what the solution is getting journalists grounded in some of the basic facts of climate change. And then beyond that, can we get them grounded in an overall sector level emissions picture? You know, as you were saying, Georgina, I don't know, the accounting isn't correct. Like, we can't trust the picture that we're being given, but we have a sense. If we have a sense and we share with audiences, like 14% or 11%, or between 11 and 20% of global emissions are coming from livestock, that's a really important starting point, because that probably is going to be surprising, even that it's that big of a portion to audiences. So helping audiences get the big picture and not being afraid of not meeting purity tests ourselves, I think is going to be really important. You know, it's going to require everyone doing a little bit to a lot. It's not going to require everyone doing everything perfectly. So when it comes to journalism, the same is true of, you know, a story we've seen time and again in US politics. It's can't make purity the enemy of action. So those are a few.
Excellent, thank you. Claire Fuesler's climate environment reporter at the Post and Courier. I'm so excited to talk to you about your kind of recent story about the Cool Food Pledge and some of the changes going on there, but also I think that one was at Roads and Kingdoms, right? Okay, but you also had mentioned when we had talked about sort of how popular kind of like food systems coverage actually is. Maybe it doesn't say food systems coverage, but you know, for your readers in South Carolina, and so that was kind of like surprising and good news to me. So, Kat, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So I work at the Post and Courier. We're the oldest newspaper in the South. We're still family owned. We're a growing newspaper. We get about 300 new subscribers each week, which doesn't sound like a lot, but for a local paper, that's actually really great. I actually left academia as someone who researched environmental sciences and climate. I left during the pandemic when I was reevaluating my priorities, went to go back into journalism and media, specifically to cover the climate crisis. And I didn't come here to like cover food, but what I found when I started covering the climate beat is that like food is the biggest thing that people are interested here in Charleston. Like it's just everything. We have our most popular newsletter is our food newsletter that people pay to subscribe to, and it's wildly popular. We're a foodie town. But I also know that we're also the epicenter here in the Carolinas for CAFOs and pork, and people know that, and people want to get away from that. And I feel like that there is an interest here, even though we're a very red state, for environmental reporting to kind of green our food systems. But what I found in doing more local reporting is that you really have to know your audience. Going back to the previous panel, people are not going to become vegetarians here. They like their barbecue too much. Like our newsroom shares the parking lot with a barbecue joint. You know, we smell barbecue, we walk outside. It's just part of the culture down here. But they are interested in eating less meat. They are interested in introducing more, you know, bringing down the greenhouse gas emissions of their plate. And meeting people there, I think, is where I've really come to see is the sweet spot. And so I've been talking a lot with our lead food reporter here at the Post and Courier about doing a series on lowering greenhouse gas emissions, but also like through the framing of, you know, we don't want to villainize, you know, people's neighborhood barbecue joint, because a lot of time these barbecue joints, they want to provide more vegan options, vegetarian options, source meat from, you know, non-CAFO sources. But we found that in talking to them, sourcing's been a huge issue because of the pandemic, you know, and so highlighting that instead of villainizing them and showing, you know, people that there are these barriers still to overcome, I think is kind of like for us a real sweet spot in getting people who would not otherwise read a Wired article or a Covering Climate Now article, but they'll read their local newspaper still. So yeah, so that's kind of my different view on the beat, and I'm just really excited that our food reporter here is so open to it. And we did our very first like package together, and it was all about kind of sustainable seafood. So, and that was one of the most popular like media packages over the past couple of months. And so now this coming summer, we're going to be doing at least one more on lowering greenhouse gas emissions of the local food systems. So yeah, that's kind of my view on how to present it for local journalism.
Yeah, and it's interesting, it's just sort of piggybacks on what Matt Reynolds was saying about kind of like, okay, so McDonald's isn't carrying Beyond, but why not? I think like, yeah, like are there ways we can sort of push to more of those stories of like going beyond kind of, and this is for anybody just to like jump in, going beyond kind of just like the hot take on an issue, and kind of digging deeper on like, well, what is the challenge? We've started to do that with cultivated meat coverage of just like, okay, so we know there's like a decrease in funding, you know, but like what are the actual roadblocks for some of these companies? And it doesn't have to be, you know, all protein coverage, but I feel like that's maybe something that I feel like more journalists who are on this beat can start thinking about, is like, what are these like deeper stories that we can do that kind of goes beyond the like, okay, fake meat was a flop kind of a story. Georgina, I don't know, have you like been able to, like, what are some of the stories that have you excited to kind of dig a little deeper?
This is the thing. It's so interesting. When I tell people I cover climate change and agriculture, they're like, "Oh, wow, you don't have you know, you must not be very busy." And I'm overwhelmed with story ideas all the time. And so my challenge is not, you know, finding a story. It's just picking which one. You know, I just to Claire's point for a minute, our food stories do really well. It could be where, you know, we focus just on climate change. And so some of our stuff gets pretty in the weeds, and maybe of all of those things, food is actually the most accessible. And, but our food stories tend to do really well. And, you know, I think just because of the publication is called Inside Climate News, there already people are, you know, a lot of readers are just not going to come to us because they already think that we're liars, because we for 15 years have taken climate change as a fact, and have not, you know, embraced both siderism. So, you know, when somebody reads Inside Climate News, they're already accepting of the science for the most part. But that said, when it comes to food, people don't want to be preached to, and I always try to make sure that the perspective of the farmer, the perspective of the you know, consumer, the dietary component makes its way into the story. That said, I think, you know, if you write a story about greenhouse gas accounting from the agriculture sector, people are already, some readers are already going to be at the sort of point where they're like, you know, suspicious of your starting point. But as far as what I am excited about covering, I'm interested right now, this is super geeky, about, and also like biting off probably way more than I can chew, but about the way the main international grain traders are operating in a world where, you know, how we grow and where we grow and how we trade is shifting because of climate change. So
yeah, No, I've been very interested in some of the sort of like international investment side of things, but it's a little hard to get some of our readers interested in that. But I personally think the story to watch.
I have the luxury of support from editors who are like, okay, sounds good, but it may not be the sexiest topic in the world. So
yeah, and like sometimes I think like it's, I think one of the things I'm picking up today and just hearing from different columnists at different outlets is like there are all these different audiences out there and sort of like different perhaps silos of people, and so like yeah, it might be your readership may be expecting a certain story, but maybe like you kind of can slowly take them along to a different one. At least that's the hopeful side of me,
Yeah, and that really does happen. The stories definitely reach beyond, they tend to jump out of the sort of typical lane, and we got a lot of eyeballs on stories that seem very, very in the weeds, but I'm always more surprised that people are engaged with this with this beat than disappointed. Happily surprised.
Oh, go ahead, Anna.
This isn't new. I don't think foreign to anyone here, but it's always important, I find, to like just state out loud that we have to be aware of, and we've all been saying it, but like be really conscious about who our audiences are and what success for a given story looks like. Like we can't expect to report a story and just want it to reach a certain segment of people. We have to know how to talk to them. And so if we're writing a story that is not inherently going to speak to power, people in power, okay, so who are we going to speak to? But we have to be really honest with ourselves about who our audience is, I think, at every turn. Yeah.
Great. Yes, I definitely agree with that. Anna, do you want to add some questions from the audience?
Yeah, it's a fascinating conversation. It's so great to hear us thinking about some of the solutions here to getting more coverage. I mean, about climate, but about the climate animal ag connection. One of the questions from the audience was, how can journalists balance fear, what's at stake in the climate crisis, with hope, such as solutions journalism, to both capture attention and impart important information well?
Anybody want to jump in?
I have a very specific mindset about this, and as a journalist, it's that my job is to kind of dive into the breach. It's not to I don't want to be overly negative all the time, but there are bad actors out there, and our job is to do something about that and point out where things are not going right, or when there's been, hypocrisy or what have you. And that, to me as a journalist, feels empowering, makes me feel like, we are contributing. That might not be a positive story. It's not a solution story, but it builds it builds up the body of work that maybe pushes us in a better direction.
Claire, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I struggle with solutions journalism because, I think if we looked at solution journalism 6-7 years ago, a lot of it was like, get a tote bag, bike to work. And, now it's shifted towards, talk to your local congressman, you're more like looking more at systems. And so I really struggle because even like what constitutes a solution journalism has really changed. Similar to Georgina, I kind of see my role as kind of calling out, like the issues, and then some, providing at times like what you can do, but I feel like that can often come with like other like forms of audience engagement, whether it be like social media or you've had like live events. I don't know. I struggle with how to incorporate kind of more the solutions without taking away from the power of again, investigatory work or other forms of reporting. So I don't know, that's not like a, that's not an answer, but it just has, there's like a tension there that every reporter has to deal with separately. And I think there's other ways to do it, and you can get creative, and we're trying to get creative here. We actually are doing a lot more live events throughout kind of in South Carolina here for our subscribers. I know that's not possible for everybody, but that's been really, really successful. They sell out. So.
Nice. Thanks, Claire. Matthew Hayek, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think it's journalists' job to manage despair versus hope, but I do think that fundamentally we need reminders that this is a human-caused problem. Therefore, there are human-caused solutions that are in the mix that scientists have been banging the drum for now decades about, and that now science-facing communication organizations are doing a much better job of actually saying proportionally what the portfolio of solutions that we need are. So I think this is actually something that's really fundamentally needed in climate journalism that I could not fully encompass in Jenny's first question to me, which is that the problems are human caused, the potential solutions will all be human instigated, and the largest things we can do are X, Y, and Z. I think that often when I just have kind of conversations on the street, I was in London a couple months ago and I accidentally tore my bag open when it got caught in the tube door. I brought it into a cobbler to stitch it back up. And he was talking to me about how Britain really cares about climate change because they recycle well in Britain. And it's like, okay, but recycling plastics, they're less than, you know, a tiny fraction of 1% of the climate problem. Just people don't fundamentally even realize that fossil fuels, animal agriculture are the causes. And I think it helps them see a lot more. It helps lots of different people, my students, see a lot more what the biggest problems are when they realize what the biggest potential solutions are. And there are resources out there for this, like Project Drawdown assembles a list of, you know, a menu of 100 climate solutions that all proportionally address something like 80% of greenhouse gas emissions. So, you know, I don't have much experience with what Claire was calling solutions journalism, but I would argue that if solutions journalism does exist, then we'd actually do really well to marry that with solutions science, or specifically mitigation science. And meanwhile, while a scientist continue to refine what that's looking like by highlighting, say, trade-offs of, you know, mitigating greenhouse gases with potentially exacerbating or benefiting some other parts of the climate equation. Like if we were to shift from beef to pork, that could potentially increase zoonotic disease risk and the number of confined animals.
Yeah, I think that's really nice, and the idea of marrying the solutions to the science to the reporting is a really great way to phrase it. Anna Hyatt.
Hi. You know, I think a lot of journalism that's being newly introduced to climate focuses on the what and not the why, and that's what makes solutions journalism more like accountability journalism. It's like why, and this is to your point that this is human caused, Matthew, that why this is happening, that diagnosis is really important for the public to understand, and largely they do not. And continuing to beat that drum in every story where you can find the opportunity. Like you might feel like you've done it before, it might feel like you've done it a million times before, but you're always going to hit a different audience, and saying it a different way every time is essential. I mean, there are more than 7 billion people on this planet, and we're trying to reach as many people as we can, and reminding them, hey, you recycling is not going to get us out of this. We have to look at the actors who got us into this and have a diagnosis that's rooted in power. And I think that's, for me, ultimately the solution, and the one lesson that journalists can really take in and apply to their work immediately.
Thanks so much. I did want to flag one comment here from Jennifer Jaquette. She says, I would pause before saying that the push for veganism is due entirely to the activists. I've seen a lot of evidence that the industry has weaponized diet, says climate activists or vegans want to take away burgers long before the vegans actually say it. And in Germany, there was the hands off my sausage campaign after Meatless Mondays were introduced. Does anybody want to make a further comment on Jennifer's statement there?
I think that's absolutely right. And, people may like their meat, but the way that the industry has seized on that and, they blow it out of proportion. And the, hands off my burger or, what's a,
Oh, the wood
cow
milk
tax,
yeah.
right? Oh, sorry, Claire.
The wood milk campaign, like this
Right.
past month with Aubrey Plaza, with the
Right.
dairy industry. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's just it's it's disproportionate to what is actually what activists are actually calling for, which is not, this radical agenda change. It's just like, maybe we ought to think about not eating meat and dairy 3 times a day, every day, and all our policies going to subsidize this very polluting industry. But that is just politically very, very toxic. But to Jennifer's point, I think it's the industry, and it's not just about the meat issue or the eating meat issue, that there's the cow tax issue and the way that they've sort of aligned with the fossil fuel industry to ensure that a lot of climate legislation doesn't get passed.
That's right. Matthew Hayek.
Just scaffolding off of the comments made so far, including Georgina's, as well as going back to Tamar's comment that I do really think that we need to hold all the producers in the mix to kind of a higher standard of empathy. And empathy doesn't necessarily mean agreeing. I mean, I think empathy can often come in the form of compassionate disagreement, and even really help us understand the problem structurally a lot better, which is, I do empathize with anyone whose livelihood is being potentially threatened. And at the same time, I've been at and had close colleagues host climate seminars where angry ranchers show up and start screaming at them that biogenic methane is different from fossil methane. And it's just like, where the hell did they hear this? I can guarantee you that, your average rancher isn't necessarily reading like IPCC papers on their own accord on the different origins of methane. And where they're getting this is work that Joe Fassler, Unearthed, et cetera, has been doing a lot recently, of finding that the national and beef checkoff programs and some of the international trade organizations are preying off of this anxiety and equipping individual farmers with kind of playbooks for how to kind of get at and manipulate the conversation using disinformation and misinformation, and from a position that's actually originating from anxiety that's entirely understandable. I do think we also need to keep in mind that the threat to the small dairy farmer or rancher is as much corporate consolidation as it may be eventual trends moving away from meat. But even in that alone, I think we can understand that, we can understand and empathize without kind of excusing that, the disinformation and misinformation, and actually be able to see the kind of astroturfing and what's going on around disinformation of the climate conversation, and hold that to a higher standard account across science and journalism.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much for that. I'm just bringing back our other panelists from panel 1, so everybody can be in the room together now. And I would like to encourage everybody to upvote any questions and keep your questions coming in, also using hashtag Making the Climate Connection on Twitter.
Can I just piggyback off of what Matthew said very quickly? I really agree, one, that we need to exercise in like compassionate reporting, regardless of who we're reporting on. I think that really resonates with our readers here in South Carolina. And two, reporting on disinformation is its own beat. you know, and I've been reporting on disinformation in the clean energy sector for the past couple of months, and it's hard. It's really, really hard. And I feel like there needs to be even more resources for reporters that are focusing on, you know, the misinformation, disinformation sector of this larger climate and food beat, because it's difficult. It's really difficult, but it's really important. So just wanted to add that.
Great, thank you. The most upvoted question at the moment is, what does the conversation need to look like around transitioning animal ag producers into other economic opportunities? So speaking to ranchers, etc., many people are less ideologically committed to meat production than they are economically so. I think some of the issue is the anti-meat people are coming to take our jobs angle. Does anybody particularly want to jump in on that?
I would just like to qualify this. I don't disagree with it, but would like to remind folks that most of the jobs in agriculture in high-income countries are not from the position of producers or landowners. They're agricultural workers. And I think agricultural workers are often looking for you know, the work that they're very good at doing, but where the biggest opportunities lie. And that doesn't necessarily have to be in animal agriculture. So that being said, there's, you know, still hundreds of thousands of individual cattle ranchers, and they're raising the cows still out on grass before the factory farms to kind of get steers and heifers ready for that final position of being fattened up in a feedlot. And those are some of actually the most jobs in American agriculture today.
Just to jump off of that too, many of those ranchers, especially the smaller ones, already have other jobs and receive, in many cases, much of their income through other revenue streams, through other jobs, sometimes not in agriculture. And so this just, I think, gets at Matthew's point here, which is that the question of opportunities outside of animal agriculture often are outside agriculture altogether. That's not to say that it's not an important question, though. I think that there are really interesting stories about farms, about companies trying to diversify, trying to expand, and to plan for any type of shifts in consumer demand.
Maybe it's actually an opportunity because, and you know, a couple people have mentioned it's not just climate, it's animal welfare. And if I mean, meat eating is not going to go away if producers can raise fewer animals better and be more profitable doing it, then I don't think too many of them would push back on that. So I think the end point is actually pretty clear. Of course, getting there is the hard part.
Yeah, I mean, coming off the back of your comment there about animal welfare as well, somebody has asked here, how can news stories center the animal? So obviously we've spoken about the other issues that, you know, the human cost, the land, the environment, obviously, but there is obviously a huge animal cost with climate crisis, whether you're talking about wild or farmed. How, like, do we see a place for including the animal angle in this conversation? Yeah, Matt.
Yeah, I think totally. It's interesting. I've definitely had pushback from editors where I've been writing about, say, the climate effects of beef, and then I say something about, you know, what it's like in a feedlot or something like that. And often the feedback you get as a writer is like, it feels preachy or people know this already. But I actually think that a lot of the time people don't know this. They don't know, like Matthew said, how, you know, cattle are raised and when they go into the feedlot and the proportion of the time they spend in these different places. They don't know that although chicken may have a lower carbon footprint, the welfare standards of chicken are very different, and also just how the welfare standards of chicken vary in the EU or the US. So I do think that it's such a relevant part of the conversation. And you know, when you're talking about what the food trends are and whether it's, you know, better to, you know, eat less beef but switch to chicken, that actually the animal welfare is a huge part of that conversation. It's not that there is an easy answer, and it really comes down to the individual's priorities. But I think we need to give people the knowledge about how these animals live different lives and what the equivalent body weights and all things like that to actually help them make those decisions. So I just think it's like, it's so central to it. It comes right alongside these other issues that you need to mention it every time, even if your editor kind of doesn't like it. And there are ways to get it in that doesn't feel preachy and isn't I don't know, off-putting for readers.
Yeah, it's like it's part of the story. So to kind of completely neglect it is like it seems neglectful. Matthew Hayak.
Yeah, it just occurs to me that I haven't yet seen a story out there that tries to connect. Maybe these exist, a few in the Amazon region, but that tries to connect the domesticated animals existing on one person's farm or barn or CAFO with the animals that are right next door. And when I dove into, for my review article, where I reviewed hundreds of articles on the links between animal agriculture and zoonotic disease, we hear this in the scientific literature that, in a tropical area, bats coming in to feed on mango trees that are pooping over a pig farm that are spreading some virus from wild to domesticated animals. You hear anecdotes every once in a while, but a real human or animal interest story in this area, I think, is incredibly needed, of actually telling a story of animals interacting that wouldn't otherwise had, humans not really intervened on that land.
Michael, did you want to contribute?
Well, I will say one larger thing about the conversation is that, when people write about climate change in the mainstream media, I think there's now this general understanding that fossil fuels cause climate change. That has become at least something that most people kind of understand and is sort of either implicit or explicit in every story about climate change. And we've been taught, it's funny how even when we're like the 12 geekiest animal agriculture people on the planet, but even we've mostly ended up talking about sort of on the demand side, do people eat meat, what are what vegan diets, dietary change, as opposed to the actual animal agriculture. And I think probably the one best thing that could happen in terms of coverage of animal agriculture is that if people understood that it takes up a third of the planet. Right? That if that became understood, and that's a huge climate thing, as people have said, it's also, now they weigh, it's a huge biodiversity thing. Like I wrote a piece in the New York Times about that, which was really kind of boring piece because it's basically like, duh, we're losing a lot of biodiversity because a third of the earth is an animal farm. I just think that to the extent that that drum gets beaten, that is something that can actually change the conversation in a way that, that some of the things that I wish people would pay attention to when I write about sort of the different ways that you can run cattle in Brazil and how you can restore degraded pastures and the, how much of the forest should be maintained and what kind of REDD+ regime is going to help provide the right incentives to keep the forest up. I think that we've all kind of agreed is a kind of tough sell for people, even though some of us are going to keep banging our spoons on our high chair about it. But in general, the idea that like, wow, cows take a ton of land, that is at least something that to the extent that becomes F9 on everybody's computer when they just sort of it's in every story. That's a way that the larger conversation can change.
I also think that, from we were talking about coverage of GMOs earlier and how, people paid attention to that because they felt like there was a personal, health component of that. This might be a little difficult to connect the dots, but the fact that a third of the planet is consumed by beef production or animal agriculture, I should say, there's a link between that and, pandemics. And, and so maybe that's a connection we should also be making, which is that this is ultimately going to affect the way we live and our own personal health.
Yeah, it's a really great point. I feel like it intersects almost everything, like the animal agriculture angle and the climate angle, as Anna Hyatt was saying earlier about it. You could cover any story and there would be something to bring in this. Claire, you had your hand raised. Did you want to say something? No. Okay, so just to let everybody know, I brought back in Connie and Joe, who were the researchers on this report. So I'd like to encourage you to ask any questions about how this research was created. While we wait for some questions specific to that from the audience come through. Do any of our panelists have any questions for the team at Faunalytics or for Jenny about how we went about doing this piece, this report?
Yeah, I do. How did you pick the articles to test? Because there are obviously so many climate pieces out there in the world, and to what extent do you think that your sample is representative of something larger?
Yeah, I can answer that one. That's a really great question. So how we went about this was, well, most of the, I guess I'll start from where we got our sources from. So we got our articles from 10 US news outlets. And from those, we obtained the 100 most recent climate articles. And that's as of September 2022. So basically what we did, we subscribed to the news outlets we needed to. We would search for the keyword climate so that we would get anything that had to do with climate. And then we would sort by date and then select anything that had the keyword climate in the title. So that is how we got our articles. So 100 from each of these 10 news outlets for a total of 1,000. And yes, so in terms of whether or not that's representative of the climate coverage that is out there, I think it largely depends on the news outlet we're talking about. So for some news outlets, this 100 climate articles was a month's worth of articles if they're constantly producing climate coverage. While for others, this was a year and a half's worth. So that there's a really big disparity there. So for some, yes, this was definitely, I would say, a good sample of what they're covering. For others, maybe not as much. And that is maybe one of the downfalls of the study. But I do feel confident in the number that we have, especially since for most of the analysis we did, we considered all articles together. So we did have a large sample size with 1,000. And so I do feel pretty confident about the conclusions we made.
I think also it was great to see that Madre Brava's analysis found something along the same lines, but we would also love to see more studies on this, of course.
I'm curious, I know this wasn't part of the study itself, but if the study gave you insight into how coverage in the US compares to coverage in other countries, because I know that there are definitely differences in consumer and kind of public awareness of the connections between meat and livestock and climate in different countries.
I know, well, we focused on US outlets just, to sort of make it simpler for ourselves, basically, is like for this study. But I know Madre Brava's analysis did look at several countries. I think I want to say Brazil, the US, but also I think China or I might be misstating that, but they definitely look outside of the US, and I think did definitely find also still a small share of coverage, but there's a lot more details in that study, and like they really got into the nitty gritty. So I think there's a lot of like interesting findings in there. Any other questions? Do we want to like wrap up with these panelists, Anna, and then kind of go to our Q&A? I've lost track of the time.
Yeah. I think
we're at this point.
We've kind of like effortlessly gone into the to the Faunalytics questioning, but there are still questions outstanding for the panel. Obviously, panelists, we've got about 10 minutes left. Feel free to head out if you need to. But yeah, there's a question here that I find quite kind of curious. Does anyone worry that if we educate the general public about meat equals climate impact, that it could lead to backlash and add to the meat realm and of the culture war issues even more so than it already is? So I guess we're talking about, are there any dangers that you could foresee in the general public knowing that meat and animal agriculture in relation to climate? Dan, I saw you nodding.
I don't think there's anyone that has a definitive answer to this, or I'd be surprised if anyone could, but certainly there has been at least in the US, some political polarization around meat, both meat consumption and around efforts to reduce meat consumption. More Democrats say that they want to reduce meat consumption than Republicans. And I think that's for many reasons, but certainly I wouldn't be surprised if, an increased salience around the climate significance of meat, I guess, contributed to that polarization further. It's not to say that it's, of course, a reason not to talk about climate. It's clearly really critical.
I think it's just yet another reason to call out disinformation in this area. I mean, the United States is a really honed, the entire kind of corporate architecture is a really well-honed disinformation PR machine. So we're already seeing really advanced, I would say, as a scientist, really advanced arguments against reducing meat consumption. And I think it's the reason why we really need to integrate the natural sciences and the journalism with the social scientists who have been banging this kind of merchants of doubt drum, and Naomi Oreskes, who wrote Merchants of Doubts, is the only one banging this drum, but really understand the kind of history and architecture of that machinery to be able to anticipate it and kind of, head it off at the turn.
Matthew, I'm going to push back a little bit on disinformation in meat, because I think that a lot of what we're seeing out of industry is stuff that they believe to their very core to be true. And, in general, I think the way that human cognition works, it's a lot easier to persuade yourself that something's true than it is to go out and lie every day. And I think when we're talking about the industry arguments about beef, it's been my policy, at least, to always assume good faith, and to assume that this is something that they believe. I think Frank Mitlaner believes everything that he writes and that he posts, and lots of people believe that too. And I think certainly a lot of it, I would say, is misinformation, but I wouldn't go so far. Disinformation is a heavy charge, and I see very little in that realm that I would level that charge at.
Yeah, I can understand and appreciate the difference between intention and outcomes. I'm largely talking about outcomes here. And I don't know if I have as refined of a taxonomy of disinformation and misinformation, but I would view a heavier instance of it as clearly being able to identify contradiction in what you yourself have said. And I've seen a lot of claims that have been made both by academics and trade groups that have intentionally framed a problem or an issue around climate to be misleading, to mislead away from the issue at hand. Say, for instance, identifying a national number in one case where it's more favorable to use the national number, and in the same sentence using the international number instead, when you could have very easily chose to keep that source consistent. So yeah, I mean, I'm concerned about the outcome. And if the outcome is a distraction, obfuscation from the truth, or an outright lie, then either way, I'm going to be incredibly worried about it and be banging that drum irrespective of intention.
Thanks, everyone. We're into about just over 5 minutes left. I think it would be great to just go around each of you and ask you just to give your final thoughts on what you would hope that journalists, or particularly journalists who are in this audience, what you would hope that they would take away from this conversation or from this report. We have a few minutes left, so I will start with who wants to volunteer to go first, and we'll go around and get the final thoughts from everybody.
Georgina, were you raising your hand, or
It looked like it.
I know. Sure.
Mr. Darley.
Shall I start?
Go for it.
Sure. One of the things that's really been popping up for me as everyone's been answering, and especially through the second panel, is that it often feels, and I'm seeing this a lot in the questions asked, that we're always making it feel like there's just like one solution or like one way forward. And I really think we need to broaden our solutions toolbox even when we're in our reporting. I think that one of the issues that is making readers and audiences feel kind of back up against the wall is that there's only one way forward. And actually our food system has many issues, and there are many ways forward, and they're different depending on geographically where you are, and also demographically who you are, and culturally how you identify. And so I think that when we're, as reporters, we can focus a lot more on like a wider set of solutions. Like we talked a lot about solutions journalism. There isn't just one solution, and we need more reporting about every solution all the time. But I also think at the same time, every food story should have the climate story kind of somewhere in there. I do believe that. I think that the food and climate literacy is just way too low, and that's what your research is showing. That's what Madre Brava's research is showing, and that's what my anecdotal research is showing when I'm just talking to people all the time. And until we get that baseline knowledge, I don't know that people are going to be absorbing the solutions and the options they have enough.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much. And we absolutely agree here at Sentient Media, getting that line of the animal agriculture in all climate reporting, that would be a great step forwards in terms of educating people and letting them make their decisions. Tamar.
I think one of the things that we haven't mentioned here today that should be more a part of this story, nobody's talked about what food actually tastes like, and that it's delicious, and that there should be joy, and that's missing from so much of this. When we reduce food to a climate issue, I think we're sort of in danger of sweeping that under the rug. And I do it myself, and I've sort of tried to self-correct with only limited success. But I think we should be talking more about the fact that we can still eat very, very well and do a little better on climate.
That's great. That's a great statement to leave on. Michael, you had unmuted yourself.
Oh, I didn't know. Well, I guess my main point is that that animal agriculture, when people talk about climate and food, I mean, they're mostly talking about animal agriculture, that it takes a third of the earth, that it's the main source of biodiversity loss on Earth. It's the main source of air and water pollution on Earth. It's the main source of antibiotic resistant superbugs. And, and then the flip side is that meat is awesome and a lot of us love it. And that in itself is like a fairly compelling, trade-off that I think, is kind of at the heart of all of these stories. And I just think that it's probably not that much to ask that, to the extent climate coverage, mentions the food system that creates a third of our emissions, that this can at least leak into the conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Matt.
Yeah, I would definitely just say, like, if there are any journalists in the audience, there are loads of good resources for like equipping yourself to answer these questions. Our World in Data, Project Drawdown, FAO Stat, like some of these questions that seem difficult to answer. There's actually really good information out there in the animal ag space, or talking to someone like Dan at TBI. And I think the other thing I would say is like, find people that are comfortable with complexity, and that the answer is, well, it's kind of complicated. Are we talking about this or this? Because there are lots of narratives that this is the answer, and I think sometimes that is true, but I think it's about kind of finding people that can actually get down into that complexity with you, and also trust your reader. That I always kind of joke that, like, the typical Wired answer is like, is this the solution to X? It's complicated, but actually that complexity is where the interest comes out. And I think if you kind of trust your reader to get down into that, you can find so much more interesting stuff that is not just rehashing some of the same conversations we have over and over again. So those are good, exciting stuff there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. And we've just launched our food and farming media network, which is open to everybody to join. We've got a lot of resources on there, following on from the recommendations in this report as well. So yeah, we'll list those resources you mentioned, Matt, and links to all of that. Dan.
I absolutely agree with other comments that we need more climate literacy broadly, as well as within journalism. And I think in addition, we also need much greater agricultural literacy. I think it's been fantastic to see the rise of so many climate desks at publications, but I think there are probably fewer and fewer agricultural desks and reporters out there. And a lot of what we've touched on is the complexity, not just of the science and climate and environmental science, but also the agricultural system itself, the structure of the industry, of policy, the different production systems involved in different places, and the number of people who work throughout it. What you're talking about, someone working on the farm producing feed crops to someone in the packing plants, actually cutting up the meat for consumers. It's an incredibly complex system, and I would love to see more of that complexity represented within coverage.
Thanks. I just want to state we are at time, but I mean, this conversation is still going and we still have over, well, almost 150 people still listening. So we're, if you're happy to stick around for a couple more minutes, Georgina, over to you.
Yeah, I agree with Tamar that people involved in ranching and cattle and dairy and any other sort of across the spectrum of animal agriculture, they're really passionate and they're good people, but that's not, as journalists, that's not what we're concerned about. I don't want to take down a person whose livelihood and history has evolved around animals, but the industry is something we should really remain skeptical of. The power, the consolidation in that industry, don't underestimate it. It is every bit as powerful as oil and tobacco before that. I think that if we give that industry too much credit by sort of kid gloving our treatment of farmers, then we're making a mistake as journalists. I'll stay skeptical, especially of an industry that makes its money off of animals.
Yeah, well said. Anna.
I wanted to double down on what Sonali said and Matthew about making the climate connection is a really important place to start in all pieces about food. I'm an editor. I'm not on the beat, and I'm as a writer, but and that's what we counsel in our work at Covering Climate Now, and it's clearly the thing that has helped people begin to make the connection between what they're seeing in their daily lives and climate change in general, not specific to food. And then also, sorry, not Matthew, what Michael said about giving audiences a sense of the overall picture, that food is 1/3 of overall emissions. A sense of the overall picture, breaking it down even a little bit, I think helps people get a sense that there's a toehold for them and begin to think that there are things that they can do or things their community can do to solve this. So those two really are mine.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And I'd love to give Connie and Joe the opportunity to share what they would have as their takeaways to any journalists in the audience. Joe, do you want to go first? Or Connie?
I can. This might be a little different from the way that others have spoken about this issue, just by the nature of my work. But I hope that one thing that journalists in the audience might take away from this is the idea that you can work with researchers to help create and find data that supports points that you might not have it for already. A lot of the data that we're talking about is more on the subject of climate and environment, and a lot of that is out there thanks to great work done by groups like the Breakthrough Institute. But if you don't have that already, there are friendly researchers out there, Faunalytics among them, who would be happy to help you try and find some additional facts and figures to back up arguments that you want to make, and that we welcome those partnerships.
Thanks. Connie, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I guess one of my biggest takeaways, there are definitely many, and I really like what Joe said. So one, yes, please, reach out to the researchers, consider the stats, consider the peer-reviewed research that exists out there, but also, I guess, remind readers that their actions have consequences, not just for themselves, not just for their country, but there are global repercussions, right? At the end of the day, we are citizens of this world. And what we do, especially in the Western world, where in the United States in particular, which has such high demand for meat, a lot of which is imported, any rise in demand here will have repercussions elsewhere, increasing deforestation and land degradation, and rising emissions and pollution, which harms the health of other people. So we do need to consider that world perspective, and I guess that one health perspective, where human health and non-human animal health and environmental health are all related, and that is where animal welfare also comes into play. So just remember that everything is pretty nicely tied together, and to remind readers of that, because I think we tend to forget a lot.
That's great, well said. Matthew Hayek, did you give your final recommendations or your final takeaway?
I think my final takeaway is pretty close to both what I reiterated and what everyone else has already said. We need more climate literacy across the board. We need a lack of carbon tunnel vision. All of that is going to require not only just more general interest in this, but resources to be provided to journalists. So thanks for what y'all are doing. Well, lastly, I will say actually that I think there is a lot of nuance to these problems. I think that people who are working with nonprofits, with PhDs, et cetera, we can help you sort out that nuance. At the same time, there are much larger versus smaller pieces of this climate pie. And I think this is the type of thing that we really need more literacy to understand, that like using paper straws is not the same as reducing meat in one's diet, or introducing policy that can actually challenge our current structures and emissions.
Thank you. And Jenny, obviously, I'd love to hear what you would like to give as your takeaway.
I'm just really grateful that everyone for this conversation today. And I guess I just wanted to highlight my two things. First of all, to sort of double down, triple down, whatever, on climate literacy. I think we are trying to share more resources and have started this food and farming media network to that end, that we can have a space for more conversations like this, where journalists can come together and say, like, is this, like, what do I need to know about this study? Like, what, can you help me unpack it? Who is an expert I can speak to? We want to have a space for that. And we welcome all food systems perspectives in that space. So hopefully journalists will join that. And then I think I also want to echo what Tamar said about delicious food. I definitely can get in the weeds and do some wonky coverage, but I also think that talking about some really delicious, talking about the delicious food options that are there is also a great way forward. And one of the recommendations we had in the report was that every food story is also a climate story, even for recipe developers, we're thinking big, we kind of want to have that kind of mindset shift. That's what we hope for in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the first step in that journey. And I'm so excited to see how many people reserve tickets, and all of you joining as panelists. This has been absolutely incredible. And obviously to Faunalytics for your help with this report, your partnership with this report. Thank you so much to each one of you who has been here today. And thank you, Jenny, for your help as well with organizing and arranging all of this. This has been fantastic. Thank you. And I shall let you all go. 10 minutes late, I'm sorry. Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.